So have y'all ever been to the county? I mean, I have. I've been to the county a few times. I'm not ashamed of it. I make no bones about it. Shit. I was young once. I got into a little trouble from time to time. Never nothing serious. You know, the majority of it was one nighters in various drunk tanks and whatnot. You know, uh, couple other little things. Like I said, nothing serious. Nothing, nothing serious like a fucking DUI or none of that shit. Uh, but anyway, once you've been to the county a few times, you come to the realization that the loudest motherfucker in there is the most shook motherfucker in there. He's loud for just no reason other than it's a defense mechanism because the motherfucker can't fight. That's you, Steel Worldwide. That's you, SWV. Mm-hmm. Bet your ass when that night he was on live PD. Bet your ass he was yapping like a fucking chihuahua, screaming for the deputy and whatnot. But yeah, I checked into your little bullshit ass fucking call-in show today for a few minutes, talking mad shit to whoever that Canadian was. I don't know who the fuck he was. And I'm just thinking to myself, will you please shut the fuck up? We all know you ain't gonna do shit. You've proven that on the AV and uploaded the shit to YouTube. Fuck out of here. Fuck out of here. How did Jay-Z put it? Loud as a motorbike, but wouldn't bust a grape in a fruit fight? Yep. Numero dos.
It's atrocious, but I bet it's a hit. That would be weird, wouldn't it? It's hard to imagine. So what if we imagine something that's just as weird, but you can see it happening? Imagine some tin-plated dictator in some poor, impoverished country who's already executing everyone he thinks is a criminal anyway, probably publicly to cow his own people and keep his regime afloat. What if he just decided, listen, there's a demand for this. I could treat it like one of those restaurants that serves endangered species on the menu where people will pay $10,000 a plate just to taste something that you've never tasted before and no one will ever taste again. How many people have seen a public execution? What do you think they'd pay to go? Be interesting to think of the lists of famous celebrities that might sign up for something like that just to say they went. A little selfie from the live execution. I'd be interested, just from a human experiment and data research sort of, point of view, of course, if the guy, this tin-plated dictator, decided to do it all pay-per-view, globally, sell $59.95, get to see the execution. There'll be some preliminaries. We're staging this for entertainment value, the way they stage these big boxing tournaments, right? You got to have opening acts. You got to have a walkout fight. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that go into keeping the public happy enough to want to buy this again. You don't get to be the dictator even of a tin-plated, little country somewhere else without having a few, bits of understanding how to play the crowd. I'd be very interested the day after something like that occurred to look at the statistics of which countries, which regions, which peoples bought into the pay-per-view more or less. Wouldn't it be interesting to see which countries shunned it or hardly bought at all versus which countries really bought more than their share? I think that would be some interesting human data. And I suppose we would have to hope that something like that, when the numbers did show up, that they didn't show it was some sort of hit. Can you imagine how that would blow open the door to incentivizing any number of cash-starved, tin-plated dictators to elbow their way into the lucrative, virtual execution tourism market? But even if something like that happened, there's a layer of emotional protection. I mean, you're not there. Just like there's a layer of emotional protection between, a live $59.95 pay-per-view execution and what a lot of people look at online right now. You can go see historic footage of assassination attempts and executions. Heck, you can go watch some of the Nazis hung for their war crimes. Not the, big people at Nuremberg, but there were lots of other punishments down the line, and some of them are online, and I don't think you're a sadist if you view it. Not at all. But there's something different, isn't it? That happened a long time ago. There's some detachment in it being a two-dimensional image, maybe even a black and white, certainly grainy, whatever. Takes you more and more away from the scene. And there's, you say to yourself, listen, there's nothing, this is like watching a boxing match 35 years ago. I know the outcome, and no one's hurting right now. So if somebody got hurt in that fight, it's long over. But if you're watching it live, it's not. I mean, just contemplate for a minute the idea of watching an execution live. I mean, if the laws changed where you live and all of a sudden this became possible and they were going to have one in the nearest good-sized city near you, how many of your friends and neighbors do you think would show up to watch? Do you think there'd be a difference between, people who make a lot of money and people who don't make a lot of money, people of one religious faith or people of no religious faith or another? I mean, do you see what I'm saying? It would be, again, interesting to see who showed up and why, just as a mass humanity psychological experiment. Would you go? If you did, what do you think would be the motivation? Curiosity? Or the idea that, listen, this isn't some staged thing like you binge watch on TV. Anything could happen, right? You don't know what's going to go on at one of these things. And if it was weird the first time that it happened, how long do you think, how many of these things would it take before people became comfortable with it? If they ever became comfortable with it. Let me blow your mind for a minute if you don't already know about this. Let's talk about an execution that occurred not in the Middle Ages, although you would think it was from there when you hear it. An execution that occurred in Paris, not all that long ago. As a matter of fact, to give you an idea of context, George Washington is a full-grown adult and has already been through a war and commanded troops in battle for the British. It involves a guy who tried to kill the King of France in the 1750s, and in March 1757, he was going to pay for that crime, and hundreds of thousands of people flocked into Paris to make sure they had a chance to see it. And according to historian Paul Friedland, the people of Paris loved executions. As a matter of fact, when he said that, he italicized the word loved. He had said that the sovereign, like all sovereigns throughout the history of the world that want to, tell their people to stay in line, that they were hoping that these public executions would terrify the population and, enhance the political sovereignty of the ruler. But as Friedland points out, that's not always why the people were there, and that's not always what they got out of it. He says in the preface to his book, Seeing Justice Done, quote, as I hope to make clear in this book, however, spectators of executions in early modern France did not tend to see the penal spectacle as a manifestation of political sovereignty, neither were they terrified. In fact, they loved attending executions. From the 16th to the middle of the 18th century, public executions in France were extraordinarily popular with spectators from all social classes, many of whom were so desperate to watch that they rented out windows overlooking the place of execution at exorbitant sums, or staked out prime viewing spots near the scaffold or on nearby rooftops, often days in advance. End quote. And what was the mood of this crowd that stormed into Paris that day to watch this event? Well, Friedland writes, and please excuse my traditional mangling of the French language when I discuss the traditional execution site in Paris, quote, every credible primary source gives the impression that the people who massed on the Place de Grève that day could barely contain their excitement as the fateful hour neared. Terror could not have been further from their minds, unless, of course, we count the terror of missing even a minute of the spectacular show that was about to take place. End quote. He then talks about a guy, Galette is his name, who liked to go to these executions, and how he showed up, quote, on that special day, he arrived bright and early to see the show, Friedland writes, and brought along with him the 18th century equivalent of movie popcorn. Now quoting from Galette's writings, quote, I showed up at 7 in the morning and found a good many of the windows of the rooms on the Grève already filled with spectators of both sexes. I was placed by Madame Superior of the establishment at a window on the first floor, and I had, as companions in curiosity, 3 gentlemen. I added my little store of provisions to theirs, and around noon we dined together with a fine appetite. End quote. Ladies and gentlemen, that man is describing an 18th century version of a tailgate party. And it will be hours before the event itself takes place. These people are partying it up in anticipation of this giant event, and this giant event is gruesome in the extreme. And what were these people so excited to watch? Well, the most spectacular, and that's the words of many different people, not me, execution of that age. And it was spectacular because it was unusual, because they hadn't done one of these really nasty ones in a while, so everyone wanted to see it. What was so nasty about it? Well, it was published ahead of time what was going to happen to this guy in notices so that people would know what they were coming to watch. And so they would know exactly what happened to people who tried to stick a knife between the king's ribs. The prisoner was sentenced to have big chunks of his flesh torn out of his breasts, arms, thighs, and calves. His right hand, which had held the knife, this is very symbolic, was to be burned, it said, by fire and sulfur. And then all the places where he'd had the flesh torn out of his body were to have, and I'm quoting here, molten lead, boiling oil, burning resin, wax and sulfur melted together, poured right into the wounds. And then his body was to be dismembered by 4 horses. Now again, this bears some delving down into what we're talking about here, and this is gruesome, and I'm sorry, but this is juxtapositioning what we're seeing here with these human beings who want to go watch it. And the more horrible it is, for many of us, the harder it is to understand the desire to be there, involved in the process. But an enormous crowd of people turned out to do just that.